5 steps of Andropov that could have saved the USSR. Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov was a man whose leadership could have drastically changed the fate of the Soviet Union. He came to power in 1982, but his reformist potential remained unrealized due to illness and an early death. However, if he had stayed in power longer, the USSR might have survived, avoiding chaos and collapse. Let's break down the 5 key steps that could have saved the country. Fight against corruption and the shadow economy. When Andropov became General Secretary, he launched an active campaign against corruption among party elites and government institutions. Under his leadership, the KGB arrested officials, uncovered embezzlement, and dismantled criminal schemes. Had he been able to see this through, the country could have developed an honest and effective governance system. Instead of a corrupt nomenklatura looting the state, skilled technocrats would have risen to power. What would this have accomplished? The state apparatus would have functioned more efficiently, and the economy would have stopped losing billions of rubles due to bribes and theft. Economic reform based on the Chinese model. The USSR suffered from the inefficiencies of a planned economy, and Andropov understood that the system needed change. He studied China's experience, where the Communist Party retained power while the economy became more flexible. Andropov could have allowed limited private enterprise, as China did, for example, cooperatives and small businesses in agriculture and trade. He could have introduced flexible management at factories, where bonuses were tied to actual performance, and opened up to foreign markets to attract technology and investment. What would this have accomplished? Product shortages would have gradually disappeared, and the economy would have grown without the shock therapy of the 1990s. Reducing military spending and avoiding unnecessary wars. A massive portion of the Soviet budget went to supporting socialist regimes worldwide. The war in Afghanistan, aid to Cuba, Angola, Vietnam, and others consumed billions. Andropov was a realist. He understood that the USSR couldn't endlessly fund foreign conflicts. He likely would have begun a gradual troop withdrawal from Afghanistan without losing face, reduced subsidies to brotherly nations, and demanded debt repayment. Instead of expanding global influence, he would have focused on strengthening the internal economy. What would this have accomplished? Huge resource savings could have been redirected to improving Soviet citizens' quality of life. Political reform without destroying the system. Gorbachev tried to democratize the USSR, but his abrupt actions led to chaos. Andropov might have taken a different approach, introducing elections for governors and mayors within the socialist system, giving Soviet republics more economic autonomy without promoting separatism, and purging party structures to renew leadership. As an experienced KGB officer, Andropov knew that sudden changes could lead to disaster. His reforms would have been slow but controlled. What would this have accomplished? The USSR would have evolved rather than collapsed, and the people would have gained more freedom without anarchy. A new social policy putting people first. By the late 1970s, living standards in the USSR were declining. People stood in lines, and the economy focused on tank production instead of food and consumer goods. Andropov could have boosted the production of consumer goods instead of excessive arms manufacturing, expanded housing construction to provide more apartments, and introduced a fairer wage system so workers earned decent pay. What would this have accomplished? People would have lived better, and social tension wouldn't have led to protests and national disintegration. What could have happened if Andropov had ruled longer? If Andropov had remained in power for even 10 years, the USSR could have reached a new stage of development. The country wouldn't have collapsed, but instead could have become something akin to modern China, a socialist state with market elements. There would have been no shock therapy in the 1990s, and no disintegration. The USSR might have become an economic giant rather than a crisis victim. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and other republics might have remained a unified state. But illness and death prevented Andropov from realizing his plans. Gorbachev took over, started reforms, but did so too fast and without control. The result, the collapse of the USSR. Yes, had Andropov ruled longer and acted as he planned, his policies could have saved the country from collapse and led it to prosperity. But history took another course. Could the USSR have become a superpower if Andropov had lived longer? If Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov had stayed in power longer, the USSR could have transformed into a completely different country. Powerful, modernized, yet still under party control. Let's imagine how the USSR could have developed if Andropov had remained in charge until at least the mid-1990s. 1984 to 1989. A period of deep reforms. Despite his health issues, Andropov would have continued his strict campaign against corruption and inefficiency. During this time, he could have fully replaced the old party elite with pragmatic and disciplined new managers. He would have continued economic reforms, creating cooperatives across various sectors but closely monitoring their development, gradually reducing state interference in production while preserving the socialist model. The USSR would have started shifting from centralized planning to a more flexible system like China's. The economy would grow without shortages, and living standards would steadily improve. People would see that the government was fighting corruption, reducing public dissatisfaction. 1989 to 1995. The USSR without Gorbachev and Perestroika. By this time, Perestroika began in real history and led to the country's collapse. But under Andropov, things could have been different. Limited private entrepreneurship would emerge under strict state control. Media would gain limited freedom but without chaos. Union republics would get economic autonomy, but not political independence. Foreign policy would become more pragmatic. The USSR wouldn't sacrifice itself for distant regimes. Union republics would stay part of the USSR, but with economic freedom like in China. There would be private stores, cooperatives, and modern technologies, all without destroying the system. The USSR would not collapse but develop into a powerful socialist state. 1995 to 2000, the USSR as a global superpower. By this time, the USSR could have become a modernized power, competitive in the global economy. Technology, IT, energy, and manufacturing would flourish. The state would build a strong industrial base, not just fulfill plans for the sake of quotas. The military would remain powerful, but the USSR would no longer involve itself in meaningless wars. Instead of the 1990s collapse, the country would grow, attracting foreign investment. The USSR could have competed with the US and China instead of losing everything it had built. Possibly, there wouldn't have been conflicts like the breakup of Yugoslavia or the Chechen War.